The Marlowe mansion was a place of silent footsteps and whispered orders, where wealth gleamed in every corner and yet warmth was nowhere to be found. Ethan Marlowe, the enigmatic millionaire who owned it, was a man feared as much as he was admired. His sharp eyes missed nothing, and his cold demeanor kept everyone at a distance. To him, emotions were liabilities, and kindness was a weakness he could not afford in his world of high stakes and ruthless decisions. Among the many staff members who maintained the perfection of his home was Clara, a young maid whose presence was as unassuming as a shadow. She spoke little, worked tirelessly, and never complained, even when exhaustion lined her delicate features. Ethan had noticed her before, though he never admitted it aloud. There was something about her quiet resilience, the way her gaze carried hidden sorrows, that tugged at the edges of his otherwise guarded heart. One late evening, after returning from a grueling board meeting, Ethan strode through the long marble hallway when he found Clara crumpled on the floor, clutching her side with trembling hands. Shock flashed through him, and without thinking, he bent down, his commanding voice softened for the first time as he asked what was wrong. Clara's eyes widened in panic, and through shaky breaths she whispered, "Please, don't lift my dress." The desperation in her tone startled him, but when she swayed and nearly fainted, instinct overrode hesitation. Gently, he lifted the hem of her uniform to see what she so desperately tried to hide, and the sight struck him like a blow. Dark bruises, angry scars, and fading marks stretched across her skin, painful stories etched into her flesh. Ethan froze, his usually composed mask shattering as he realized this was no accident, no simple fall. This was cruelty, deliberate and repeated. For a moment, he could not move, his mind torn between fury and disbelief. Clara quickly pulled her dress down, tears slipping silently down her cheeks, pleading with him not to dismiss her from work. Ethan, still on his knees beside her, stared into her eyes, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar ache. That night, in the grand silence of his mansion, Ethan Marlowe understood for the first time that beneath the polished world he commanded, there were battles far darker than his own, and Clara carried them alone. Ethan could not erase the image of Clara's bruises from his mind, even as he sat in his study with contracts and financial reports spread before him, his eyes lingered on the papers but his thoughts remained with her. The following morning, he found her in the kitchen, quietly preparing breakfast with the same diligence she always displayed, as though the night before had not happened. Yet he noticed the stiffness in her movements, the way she winced when she reached for a heavy pot, and it fueled a growing storm inside him. Determined, he waited until the other staff dispersed before approaching her, his tone low but unyielding as he demanded an explanation. Clara froze, her hands trembling over the bread she was slicing, and for a long moment she said nothing, her lips pressed tightly together. But when Ethan's gaze softened, not the gaze of a master to a servant, but of a man seeking truth, her defenses began to crack. With her eyes fixed on the floor, she confessed in a voice barely above a whisper that the scars were not from accidents, but from years of cruelty at the hands of her husband. He had once been charming, but soon turned violent, controlling every aspect of her life until escape became her only chance at survival. Clara revealed that she had been running ever since, changing her name, working low-paying jobs where no one would ask questions, hiding her identity in the shadows. Fear still gripped her every day, for she knew he was a man of influence who would not rest until he reclaimed what he believed was his. Ethan, who had built his empire on logic and control, felt something unexpected stir within him, a fierce anger at the faceless man who had dared to treat her this way, and an even stronger instinct to protect the fragile maid standing before him. Clara begged him not to dismiss her, insisting she needed this job to stay hidden and survive, but Ethan surprised even himself with his response. He told her she was not just an employee, that she deserved more than fear and suffering, and though his words were gruff, the look in his eyes was one of undeniable resolve. For the first time in years, Clara felt a flicker of hope, and Ethan Marlowe, the man who thought he had no heart, realized he was already entangled in hers. Days passed in uneasy calm, but Ethan noticed Clara growing restless, her eyes often darting toward the mansion's tall windows as though she feared the world outside. Despite his assurance that she was safe within his walls, she seemed to carry the weight of invisible chains. One stormy evening, As rain lashed against the glass and thunder rolled through the sky, Ethan returned from a late meeting to find Clara standing at the doorway, pale and trembling. Following her gaze, he saw the unmistakable sight of a black car idling at the gates, its tinted windows concealing whoever sat within. Clara's lips parted in a whisper, her face drained of color. "It's him," she murmured, her voice breaking. Panic surged through her body, and she instinctively moved toward the back exit, her only thought to run before he could find her. But Ethan caught her wrist firmly, not in control, but in protection. "You don't run anymore," he said, his voice calm yet commanding, and for the first time she looked into his eyes and saw not coldness but steel forged in her defense. Moments later, the gate clanged open, and a tall, broad man stepped into the courtyard, his presence radiating menace. Clara's ex-husband had tracked her down, his voice booming through the rain as he demanded she return with him, spitting threats that chilled her blood. But before Clara could crumble under the weight of fear, Ethan stepped forward, his imposing frame shielding her completely. The ruthless businessman who had once broken rivals in boardrooms now stood unshaken against a predator, his voice carrying the sharpness of command as he warned the intruder that Clara would never be touched again. The man sneered, throwing accusations, but Ethan had already anticipated this. He had gathered evidence of Clara's suffering, ready to expose him for the monster he was. In a matter of minutes, the abuser who had haunted Clara's every waking thought was reduced to a desperate man caught in a web of influence far greater than his own. Clara, watching from behind Ethan's shoulder, felt something she had not felt in years: safety. As the storm raged outside, she realized the walls of the mansion were no longer just her hiding place, they had become her refuge, and the man who owned them had become her shield. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in Clara's heart as she sat in the quiet of the mansion's library, staring at the flickering firelight while her thoughts spun between disbelief and relief. Her abuser was gone, taken into custody after Ethan leveraged his wealth, evidence, and influence to expose every crime he had tried to bury. For the first time in years, Clara could breathe without fear that a shadow lurked behind her. Yet freedom was something she no longer knew how to hold. She had lived so long in survival that the idea of living felt foreign. Ethan, who had once been nothing more than a distant figure of authority, had changed before her eyes. Where she had expected indifference, she found patience, and where she had braced for judgment, she found compassion. He didn't force her to stay, nor did he treat her as fragile, he simply gave her space, offering her dignity in every word and action. Days turned into weeks, and in that time Ethan arranged for her to begin studies she had long abandoned, encouraging her to dream beyond servitude. The mansion that had once felt like a gilded cage became a sanctuary, filled with possibilities. Slowly, Clara's laughter returned, soft at first, then freer, echoing through halls that had never known such warmth. Ethan, who had lived his life believing emotions were liabilities, found himself seeking that laughter, cherishing it more than all the riches he owned. Their bond was not built on pity but on respect, a recognition of strength in one another, her resilience, his determination. One evening, as they stood on the balcony overlooking the city lights, Clara turned to him, her eyes no longer haunted but alive with hope. "You saved me," she whispered, but Ethan shook his head gently, his gaze steady. "No, Clara, you saved yourself. I only stood by you." In that moment, she understood that the scars on her body no longer defined her, and Ethan understood that his heart, once encased in ice, had finally learned how to beat for someone else. Together, they stepped into a new beginning, not as master and maid, but as two souls who had found love in the most unexpected place.